The summer sun burned hot over the wide open plains, painting the wooden rooftops of the small frontier town in gold. Dust rose from the main street as wagons rolled by, wheels creaking and horses snorting in the heat. Folks went about their business with slow, measured steps, the kind of rhythm that belonged to people who had worked this land long enough to know it never bent to their will. It was a place where a man's word carried weight, where the law was sometimes written in ink, but often carried on the barrel of a gun, and where dreams of a new life rose with every sunrise. He stood outside the saloon, sleeves rolled up and hat tilted back, eyes set on the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone. The rancher was known to many in town, respected for the sweat he had poured into his cattle herds and the land he tamed with his own 2 hands. Yet for all his grit and strength, there was a hunger in him that the townsfolk had begun to notice. It wasn't the hunger for more acres, more cattle, or more coin. No, his yearning was quieter, tucked behind the lines of his sun-browned face. He wanted a bride, young and sweet, someone who could bring warmth into the big empty house that sat at the edge of his ranch. It had become a subject of hushed talk in the mercantile and its Sunday gatherings. Some said he had written eastward, sending word to folks who arranged such things, hoping for a modest girl with kind manners and gentle ways. A bride who would smile shyly at the supper table, who would sit by the fire with her stitching, and who would give him children to carry on his name. The kind of woman who would slip into his life as quietly as a spring breeze, never stirring up a storm. That was what he wanted, or at least what he thought he wanted. But the prairie has a way of surprising men who believe they can order their futures like they order fence posts or seed. The day the stagecoach rolled into town, rattling to a stop in a cloud of dust,
no one could have guessed what kind of woman would step down from its worn steps.
She wasn't small or timid, not the picture of shy sweetness he had been expecting. Instead, she carried herself like someone who belonged nowhere and everywhere, all at once. Her dark hair tumbled around her shoulders, her eyes sharp as polished coal, and her figure well. It made heads turn before she even spoke a word. The townsfolk stared, whispering under their breath, while the rancher's jaw tightened. He hadn't asked for a woman like her. She was bold, with curves that refused to be ignored, and a presence that seemed too large for the quiet, careful life he had been planning. She looked at him then, right in the eye, as though she already knew the storm she was about to bring into his world. That single glance was enough to make him feel as though the ground beneath his boots had shifted. She walked toward him with a confidence that rattled his well-ordered mind. Every step of her boots on the wooden planks echoed louder than the chatter behind them. She didn't lower her gaze or soften her smile. Instead, she tilted her chin just enough to challenge him without speaking, as if daring him to reconsider everything he thought he wanted. "Are you the man who sent for a bride?" Her voice carried smooth and steady, just a trace of something untamed in it. He opened his mouth, but the words didn't come as easy as they usually did. He was used to commanding men on horseback, giving orders that sent cattle moving across wide fields. Yet this single woman left him grasping for solid ground. The answer ought to have been simple. Yes, he was that man. Yes, he was waiting for someone. But this wasn't who he had pictured stepping down from the coach. The sun seemed hotter then, the air heavier, as the town waited for his reply. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed, and a dog barked at a passing wagon. Life moved on, but for him. Time narrowed into the space between her steady eyes and his pounding heart. She had not come to be quiet or meek, not much was certain. She wasn't the sweet young bride of his imagining, the kind who would slip gently into his days without stirring the dust. No, this woman looked like trouble, the kind of trouble a man tried to avoid, but somehow couldn't resist. And in that moment, he realized something he wasn't ready to admit. Not even to himself. He was already losing control. Her hand brushed against the doorframe of the saloon as she leaned just slightly, waiting for him to speak. Behind them, a few men shuffled their boots, eager for the show, and the women whispered behind their hands. It was as if the whole town knew that whatever happened next would not be ordinary. He cleared his throat, steadying himself, and managed to say her name, though it felt strange, almost dangerous on his tongue. She smiled then, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that struck him harder than any fist ever had. In that smile lay a promise, or maybe a warning. She hadn't come west to be tamed. She hadn't come to fit neatly into the space he had prepared. She had come to claim something. And deep down he knew it might just be his peace of mind, his carefully built plans, and maybe even his heart. The rancher stood taller, trying to mask the sudden unease coursing through him. He had thought he was ready for marriage, ready for the gentle warmth of a simple bride. But now, staring into the dark, daring eyes of the stranger who had arrived in her place, he began to wonder if fate had other plans, and as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town, he felt the first tug of a battle he wasn't sure he could win. Would he fight against her presence, holding fast to the life he thought he wanted? Or would he give in to the storm she carried, risking everything he had built for the fire she brought with her? The answer, though still unspoken, pressed heavy on his chest, and every heartbeat reminded him that nothing would ever be the same again. The town waited, the stranger's smile lingered, and he found himself standing on the edge of a choice that could change everything. The silence stretched long between them, broken only by the creak of the saloon's swinging doors and the faint jangle of spurs as men shifted their weight. The stranger did not look away, and the rancher found himself caught in her steady gaze. He told himself it was just the surprise of it all, that he only needed a moment to adjust. But in truth, something inside him stirred in a way that unsettled him. She didn't fit the picture he had carried in his mind for weeks. That quiet bride who would step down from the stagecoach with a soft smile and lowered eyes. Instead, here stood a woman whose very presence unsettled the dust of the town. A woman who carried herself with the boldness of someone who had walked through fire and learned not to flinch. He gestured stiffly toward the street, trying to mask the unease in his chest. "I was told to expect someone," he said at last, his voice steady but lower than usual. The words sounded strange even to his own ears, as though they belonged to another man. The stranger tilted her head, her dark curls brushing her shoulders, and gave him a look that carried equal parts amusement and challenge. "Then I suppose I'm that someone," she replied, her tone as calm as if she were commenting on the weather. The confidence in her voice struck him harder than he cared to admit. They stood there a moment longer, neither moving, until the rancher finally stepped aside, offering her room to pass into the shade of the saloon's porch. She walked by, skirts swaying with each step, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt as if the entire town had shifted on its axis. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the stagecoach had rumbled back down the road, he found himself still thinking about her. He remembered the letters he had sent, the careful words he had written to the agency that promised introductions, the clear description of what he wanted. A sweet, modest bride, someone untouched by the wildness of the frontier, someone who would ease the long nights with her gentleness. He had been very specific, yet what he had received was nothing like the picture he had painted. The more he thought about it, the more questions crowded his mind. Who was she, really? Had there been some mistake in the arrangements? Or had she known all along what kind of life awaited her here, choosing to step into it with the certainty of someone who wasn't afraid to disrupt it? That evening, he sat on the porch of his ranch house, the sun setting in streaks of fire across the plains. The cattle moved in slow herds, their silhouettes dark against the glowing horizon. It should have been a peaceful moment, the kind that reminded him why he had worked so hard to build a life out here. But peace was far from him. His thoughts circled around the stranger, around the way her smile had lingered, as if she knew something he didn't. When he closed his eyes, he could almost see the life he had planned. A quiet home filled with the sounds of laughter and the warmth of companionship. Yet every time he tried to picture it, the stranger's face cut into the image, her sharp eyes shattering the fragile dream he had clung to. The following days did little to ease the tension. She settled into the town with surprising ease, though not in the way people expected. Instead of staying quiet and reserved, she asked questions. Bold ones about the land, the ranch, the work it took to keep cattle fed through winter. She walked into the mercantile with her head high, unbothered by the whispers that followed her. She wasn't sweet or demure. She was something else entirely, something that pulled attention without asking for it. The rancher found himself torn. Part of him wanted to push her away, to remind her that she wasn't what he had asked for. But another part of him, one he didn't want to acknowledge, was drawn to her fire. He had lived his life by order, by the rules of hard work and steady hands. Yet when she was near, he felt a pull toward something unpredictable, something dangerous. One night, as the lanterns flickered low in the saloon, he heard her laugh. It wasn't the kind of laugh that blended into the room. It was rich and full, carrying through the air in a way that made men turn their heads. He felt a knot tighten in his chest. That laugh didn't belong to the image of the bride he had wanted. It belonged to someone who could undo him if he'd let her. The townsfolk noticed the tension too. They spoke of it quietly over church pews, and at the pump where water splashed into buckets. Some said the rancher had gotten more than he bargained for. Others said fate had a way of giving a man what he needed rather than what he asked for. Either way, the air between them crackled with something the whole town could feel. He tried to stay focused on his work, riding out with the cattle hands, mending fences, and checking the water supply. Yet no matter how far he rode, the thought of her clung to him like the dust of the plains. He caught himself replaying the way she had stood on the saloon porch unflinching. As if she had been waiting her whole life for a man to tell her no end, as if she had no intention of hearing it. The nights grew restless. He'd sit by the fire with a cup of coffee, staring into the flames, wondering why she had come. Why fate had delivered her to him instead of the gentle soul he had envisioned. Was this some mistake to be corrected, or was it the kind of twist in life that a man couldn't run from? One evening, as the cicadas hummed in the tall grass and the wind swept low across the fields, he found himself walking into town. The lamps glowed warm against the twilight, and he knew before he even stepped onto the boardwalk that he would see her there. Sure enough, she leaned against the post outside the saloon, her eyes catching the lantern light. She saw him approach and gave him that same knowing smile, the one that felt like both a dare and a promise. He stopped short, caught between the urge to turn away and the need to demand answers. The words built in his throat, rough and unsteady. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice breaking through the quiet night. Her smile only deepened, her gaze holding his. "Maybe I'm here because this is where I belong," she said softly. Yet with a certainty that struck him harder than any truth he had faced before, he didn't answer. He couldn't. The air between them thickened, and he felt the weight of every choice pressing down on him. He wanted to believe he could still turn back, still insist on the life he had planned, but deep down, he feared it was already too late. The stranger didn't move, didn't flinch. She stood there as steady as the land itself, leaving him with the one thing he had always tried to avoid, uncertainty. And as the night settled over the town, he realized he was no longer the man who had waited for a sweet young bride. He was a man standing at the edge of a storm, one that carried both ruin and possibility. Would he resist her fire, or would he let it consume him? That answer remained locked inside him, hidden even from himself. As the sound of her voice lingered in the dark and the pull between them grew stronger with every passing moment, the wind changed. The next morning, a dry sweep that carried the smell of dust and a hint of rain that never came. The rancher woke before dawn and saddled his horse in the blue light. Needing distance from town and from the stranger who had unsettled his plans, he rode the fence line with a coil of wire across his saddle horn, letting the quiet of the open land clear his thoughts. Cattle grazed along the creek bed, tails swishing, ears twitching at flies. It should have calmed him. Instead, he kept thinking of the stagecoach, the saloon porch, the way she had looked right through him as if she saw both the man he was and the man he fought to hide. By noon he reached the far pasture, where the grass grew thin and the fence sagged under its own weight. He dismounted and set to work, hands steady with the comfort of a task he knew well. He had built these fences post by post. They were the bones of his livelihood, the line between chaos and order. While he worked, he heard a second set of hoofbeats. He looked up and saw the dust plume first, then the rider. The sheriff pulled up and tipped his hat. deep creases around his eyes from years of squinting at the horizon. "Got a visitor in town who asks a lot of questions," the sheriff said, voice even. "Figured you might want to know." The rancher's jaw set hard. "Questions about what?" "About land, brands, old cattle drives, and about you," the sheriff added, watching for a reaction and finding one in the tightness of the rancher's mouth. "She has a right to ask," the rancher said, turning back to the wire. "It is a free country," mostly, the sheriff said. "But free can tangle with trouble when folks stir up old stories. You know how this town remembers." The rancher did. The town remembered the winter when cattle starved. It remembered the night a wagon burned on the north road. It remembered the day a ranch farther west was sold for pennies after a debt came due. The frontier had sharp edges. He had learned to keep his own stories quiet. He did not want the stranger prying them open. "She came on that coach for you," the sheriff said. "Not a secret anymore. I sent for someone else," the rancher said, then stopped, surprised at his own honesty. "I wanted a small life, clean, steady." The sheriff nodded. "I know what you wanted. I also know what is here. A woman who looks like she has crossed more than one line. A drought that circles closer every day. Railmen sniffing at the valley, saying a track might run through your east pasture. And now a neighbor who claims your creek is shifting. Times like this do not reward a small life." The rancher felt the words sink in. The sheriff studied him, then turned his horse. "One more thing," the sheriff said. "A man asked around the depot yesterday. Did not give a name. Carried a scar under his left eye. He showed a card with numbers like a code and asked where the coach from the South Line dropped its passengers. If he comes back, I will want to know who he seeks. My guess is it is her." After the sheriff left, the rancher finished his work with a knot in his gut. He rode home late, dust in his throat and a new tension in his shoulders. Lights were on in town as he passed. The saloon doors swung open on voices and the clink of glasses. He almost kept going. Then he saw her through the window, sitting at a small table with a ledger, a cup of coffee beside it. It's a focus that made everything around her fade. She was writing with careful strokes, pausing now and then to lift her gaze and listen. She did not look like a woman waiting to be chosen. She looked like a woman making a plan. He stepped inside. The piano was silent, and a handful of card players looked up and then lost interest. She did not startle when he approached, as if she had expected him. He noticed the ledger more closely. It was filled with neat columns, names, dates. "You taking stock of the whole town?" he asked. "Not the whole town," she said. "Only the parts that touch my life. I like to know what ground I stand on." He set his hat on the chair back and lowered his voice. "The sheriff says a man with a scar asked after the stagecoach. Did you leave trouble behind?" She folded the ledger and clasped it to her chest. "It is fair to ask," she said. "I will tell you this much. I have debts that are not counted in money. I am not hiding from the work of a new life. I came west for that. But I am not naive. The past is a poor traveler. It follows whether you look back or not." He waited for more. She did not offer it. He could sense the line she had drawn and knew pressing too hard would make her walk away. So he changed course. "There is talk of a rail track," he said. "Men with suits and maps? They claim the valley belongs to progress. That track could cut through the east pasture and make a city out of this dust. It would bring freight and strangers. It would also bring fences that I do not control." She listened, eyes steady. "Then you need allies," she said. "And you need to know your neighbors. Not the stories told about them. The truth. I can help with that." He felt the old resistance rise. He had always handled his problems alone. Partnership sounded like risk. Still, heard the sense in her words and the strength under them. "What do you want in return?" he asked. "Food and a roof until I know where I belong," she said. "A chance to earn my keep. I can keep books, ride when needed, and I do not scare easy." He looked at her hands. They were strong and marked by work. He thought about the empty rooms in his house. He thought about the man with the scar. He nodded. You can come up tomorrow, he said. We start before sunup. The next day, she rode beside him through low morning fog. The ranch hands looked curious, but he let his silence stand as explanation. They rode fence and checked the creek, she asked. Questions with the care of someone sketching a map, storing the shape of his world. When the sun climbed high, they stopped in the shade of cottonwoods. She shared dried apples from her bag and told him about a small town back east where riverboats tied up and gamblers came on weekends. She mentioned a sister who married a store clerk. She did not mention parents or childhood. He noticed the gaps and did not press. That week, trouble began to show new edges. A neighbor to the south, a man with a thin beard and a habit of smiling when he was angry, came riding with a claim that the creek had changed course in the spring. Taking water from his land? Nature moves, friend, he said. Water has will. It turned its back on me and found your shade. Fair is fair. We should share. The rancher kept his voice calm. The original markers show the creek as it runs now. If you want to drag this into the courthouse, I will bring the surveyor's book. The neighbor glanced at the stranger standing near the horses. His eyes flicked over her with a look that tested for weakness. You brought a bookkeeper to fight me, he said. She only smiled. I brought a witness, she replied. 2 hands count the fence posts faster than one. We will mark each one and write the dates. Judges like facts. The neighbor's smile thinned. He tugged his reins and rode off, leaving a small cloud of dirt and the weight of a new feud. The ranch house changed with her presence. Supper no longer sat cold on a plate left for later. The kettle sang, the floor was swept, and a line of herbs dried near the kitchen window. She moved with quiet purpose, but she did not shrink into corners. At night, she read by lamplight and kept that ledger close, as if it was both shield and compass. He learned she could shoot a pistol with accuracy born of practice, though she did not boast of it. He learned she could ride hard and still arrive neat. He learned that in a fight of words, she could slice a man's argument without raising her voice. And he learned how much that unsettled him, because it made his need for her feel like a weakness he had never allowed himself. Other tensions tightened. A deputy from a rail company stopped by with letters that promised payment if he would sell a strip of land now, the warning that the price would drop once the right-of-way became law. The deputy was slick and kind in the manner of men who make a living off signatures. The rancher asked for time to think. The deputy smiled and left his card. When the rancher turned the card over, he saw a small marking in ink. A fraction. 3 short numbers. The same kind of code the sheriff had mentioned. That night, somewhere near the north pasture, coyotes set up a call that sounded like laughter. The stranger stood on the porch and watched the stars. He joined her, and they stood in the cool air, the land stretching black and silent to the mountains. Do you ever feel a choice? Closing in? He asked. She rested her palms on the rail. I feel the weight of roads. Sometimes a road picks you. I did not ask for a road with you, he said. The words came harsh and truer than he meant. She did not step back. I did not ask to be sent to a man who wanted a different woman, she said, voice steady. Yet here we are. The only honest thing to do is meet the day and keep your hands open for what it brings. He wanted to argue. He did not know how. He went inside with the sound of her calm voice lingering and wondered whether calm was a lull before a storm. Mist rolled in the following morning and brought with it a rider from the telegraph office. The boy carried a slip that looked like any other message, but the words on it hooked deep. A short line asked whether the woman who arrived on the last South Line coach still remained in town. It was signed with initials and a city he knew only by reputation. It's a kind of city where money changed hands in rooms without windows. The rancher gave the message to her. She read it and did not change expression. You know the sender? He asked. I know the city, she said. It belongs to men who keep records and men who break them. If someone is counting my steps, it means my freedom matters to them for reasons that will not flatter me. Then you should stay close to the ranch, he said. If someone rides in asking questions, I want to be the one who answers. You want control, she said. It was not an accusation. It was a fact laid between them with care. I want safety, he replied. For you and for what I have built, she studied him, then nodded. Then we will keep working and keep watch. A week later, the man with the scar arrived. He came at dusk, shoulder tilted as if a long ride had stiffened it, and he dismounted at the pump with the ease of someone who had handled horses most of his life. The scar cut down from his left eye and pulled when he smiled, which he did often but without warmth. He introduced himself to the hands as a messenger for a distant firm that invested in land. He claimed he wanted to buy and sell information, nothing more. No one believed him, but no one called him a liar. He drifted into town and took a room above the feed store. He spent afternoons at the saloon asking easy questions. What families had money? Who owed on mortgages? Which ranchers drank too much? He tipped politely when men answered. He tipped more when they did not. And sometimes, when the rancher or the stranger walked into the room, he would look up with an expression that said he knew exactly why he was here and planned to enjoy. The slow reveal. The town became a board set with pieces. The sheriff moved steady, watching. The rail deputy brought new papers with new promises. The neighbor to the south set riders to patrol near the creek, clearly hoping to provoke a fight that could be spun as defense. The man with the scar whispered into eager ears and smiled as tempers warmed, and in the center of it, the rancher and the stranger tried to hold their ground while the line between partnership and something deeper blurred more with each passing day. A small subplot grew quietly at the edge of everything. An older widow who ran the boarding house began to take in seamstress work from the railmen, stitching cuffs and collars to a standard they praised. She started asking the stranger questions about figures and letters. The two women spent evenings over the ledger, heads bent together, turning small numbers into a plan for the widow to buy her building from the bank before the railmen did. It was the kind of work that gave the stranger purpose and made the rancher see how her presence spread like water. Under dry ground, another thread wound through the hills. A group of homesteaders east of the valley had run short of seed and were forced to borrow at rates that would break them by winter. The stranger learned this from a child who came to the ranch for a jug of milk. When she told the rancher, he shook his head at first. He had his hands full with his own trouble. Yet he knew what starvation looked like. He sent a wagon of feed and salt with her as escort and told himself it was goodwill that would come back to him someday. He tried not to notice how proud she looked riding out ahead of the team, hair tied back, eyes bright with purpose. He also tried not to notice how he leaned toward the door the entire time she was gone, listening for wheels on the road. When she returned after dark, he said nothing about his worry. She said nothing about the way his shoulders relaxed when he saw her. They carried the silence like something fragile that might become real if named. The man with the scar noticed everything. He watched the widow in the ledger. He watched the homesteader's wagon. He watched the creek and the riders set to guard it. One night he stopped the rancher on the boardwalk and spoke in a voice that could have been friendly if not for the sharpness. Underneath, you built a fine place, he said. But you built it on stories that have not been told. I am a collector of such things. Stories can be traded like cattle if a man knows the right market. The rancher kept his temper. You will find my story dull. I rarely find dull on the frontier, the man replied. Every quiet town has a day it pretends did not happen. Every strong man has a choice he regrets. And every woman with eyes like that has a past full of debts that arrive late and demand payment with interest. The rancher stood still and looked the man in the face. If you come near my house, I will take it personally, he said. Of course, the man said, and the scar pulled when he smiled. The land held its breath. Heat pressed down. No rain came. The cattle grew thin along the creek. The neighbor to the south filed a note with the courthouse. The rail company held a meeting at the hotel and invited the town to hear about progress. The widow gathered coins in a tin and kept sowing. The homesteaders planted a second time with seed paid for by strangers' kindness. The sheriff cleaned his rifle and said little. And at night the rancher and the woman sat with the ledger open and the map spread across the table. Two sets of hands tracing lines that might become a future if they could only hold off the past. One evening a letter arrived without return address. Inside was a single page with a list of names and a date from years ago when a cattle drive had gone wrong near the river crossing. The list included men the rancher knew, and one he had not seen in a long time. At the bottom was a short line that said a missing share had never been paid, and that the debt belonged to the man who lived at the edge of the valley now. His throat tightened as he read it. He did not tell her everything, not yet. He folded the paper carefully and put it under the ledger, as if weight could keep old ghosts from rising. He went outside and looked toward the dark line of the pasture. Somewhere out there, men were moving pieces he could not see. Somewhere in town, the man with the scar waited for the next turn. Somewhere on the road, second messenger might already be riding. He stood alone under the stars and felt the shape of the conflict close around him. Protection against the rail track, water rights, and the neighbor's claim. A shadowed debt that threatened to pull him backward. And the woman who had walked into his life with a ledger, a steady hand, and a past that might be the spark for all of it. He could feel the choice pressing on him again, sharper now and nearer. He lifted his gaze to the dark horizon and swore he would hold the land, the house, and the people under his roof. Swore it like a vow spoken to the open sky. From the road came the faint clatter of hooves. He listened, heart tight, knowing the next rider could be a friend or a fuse. And knowing that once the next word was spoken at his door, nothing in the valley would stay quiet for long. The sound of hooves grew louder, each beat echoing across the valley until it pressed against the walls of the ranch house. The rancher stood stiff on the porch, one hand braced against the rail, eyes locked on the dust rising from the road. A single rider appeared through the haze, cloak flapping behind him like a dark banner. The horse was lathered, its chest heaving, the rider pushing it hard as if chased by something unseen. The woman stepped out of the doorway, lantern in her hand. The glow lit her face in gold, but her eyes were sharp, already measuring the threat. The rider slowed near the gate, pulling the horse hard, and for a moment silence hung heavier than any sound. Then he spoke, voice rough from travel. Letter from town. The rail company called a meeting for tomorrow night. They mean to decide the route. They want every rancher there. Sheriff says it will not be talk alone. Men are carrying irons under their coats. The rancher took the folded paper and scanned it, though the words hardly mattered. He knew what it meant. The track would not only cut through land, but through the life he had carved, pulling it into a tide of strangers of profit, if claims he could not fight with his bare hands. He felt the woman's gaze on him, steady and unflinching, as if she were asking whether he would finally admit that the fight was no longer at the edge of the horizon. Right on his doorstep. That night he slept little. The sound of coyotes rose in the dark, and the cry of an owl carried over the hills. He thought of the scarred man in town, whispering into eager ears. He thought of the neighbor by the creek, sharpening his grievance into a weapon. He thought of debts scribbled on old paper, debts that did not die with time. And he thought of her, the stranger who had come in place of the bride he wanted, the one who now sat at his table with her ledger open, writing with calm strokes, as if the storm around them could be bent into. Order if only she kept counting. At dawn, the ranch hands moved uneasy, whispering about the meeting and the men they had seen riding in from outlying farms. Some carried rifles across their saddles in plain sight, as if daring the law to object. The sheriff came by in the afternoon, eyes shadowed, jaw tight. He said the meeting was already swollen with temper, that the railmen promised prosperity. While the ranchers muttered about theft and ruin, "You'll need to speak," the sheriff told him. "The valley listens when you stand up. But listen back too. They'll be looking for a leader. And if you take that role, you'll be tied to it when the powder blows." The rancher said little, but his stomach burned with the weight of choice. That evening, he and the woman walked the pasture line, the cattle restless under the setting sun. She asked no questions at first, letting the quiet stretch until he finally spoke. "They will want me to stand. But I was never one for speeches." "You do not need speeches," she said. "You need truth. Speak it plain, and men will follow. Speak it weak, and they will scatter to the first hand with coin." He looked at her, the curve of her jaw, the way her hair caught the fading light. "And if truth is not enough, then you hold ground," she said. with words first. With steel, if you must. They turned back to the house. And for the first time, he noticed her hand rests on the edge of the revolver at her side, not with threat, but with readiness. It struck him how natural it looked, how far she was from the soft vision of a quiet bride. And it struck him harder still how much he needed her there. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, the meeting filled the hotel hall with heat and voices that cracked like whips. Lamps smoked against the ceiling, casting long shadows over the crowd. The railmen stood at the front, polished boots and pressed coats, their maps unfurled across the table. They spoke of growth, of progress, of markets and cities. They promised work for the poor, wealth for the landowners. A new chapter for the valley. The ranchers pushed back with anger sharpened by drought and hunger. They spoke of water rights, of herds driven thin, of families holding on by the skin of their teeth. The sheriff tried to steady them, but his voice was one against a tide. Then the scarred man rose. Leaning against the far wall with that half-smile pulled crooked by the mark on his face, his words slid smooth, each one finding a crack in the crowd. He told them rail was inevitable, that fighting it was like spitting at the wind. He said men could make peace with the change or be broken under it. And he said he knew of debts, of hidden claims, of stories the valley had buried, all of which could be brought into the open if men resisted too hard. The room rippled with unease. The rancher felt heat crawl up his neck. He knew the scarred man spoke of him, though no name was given. He started to rise, but then the woman stood first, her ledger in hand. Stories can be used like shackles, she said, her voice carrying across the hall. But so can silence. We have lived too long in silence. If progress comes, let it come fair. Let men speak plain of who owes what, of who claims what, of who paid with blood, and who paid with coin. If debts exist, they will be settled, but not by strangers who twist them into chains. A murmur spread, low and sharp. Some nodded, some scowled. The scarred man's smile thinned, but he did not move. The rancher rose then, his voice rough but steady. This valley was not built by maps or numbers. It was built by hands. You want a track, you lay it straight, and you pay fair for the ground you take. You threaten men with debts. You best be ready to prove them under the sun. I'll not bow to shadows whispered in corners. If you bring ruin, you'll face me first. The hall broke into noise, shouts crashing against each other, fists pounding tables. The sheriff tried to calm them, but the tide had turned wild. The railmen gathered their maps, their polished calm cracking under the storm. The scarred man leaned back against the wall, his smile gone. Eyes narrowed like a wolf's. The woman stood firm, ledger pressed to her chest, watching every move. She could see the moment fracture into something dangerous, could see men edging hands toward their belts. And she knew this night was only the start. After the meeting, the street outside seethed with voices. Lanterns swung, horses stamped, men argued in knots that spilled from one side of the road to the other. The rancher felt the weight of eyes on him, some filled with hope, others with suspicion. He walked beside the woman, silent, until they reached the hitching rail. You painted a target on yourself, she said quietly. It was already there, he replied, from the corner of his eye. He saw the scarred man slip into the alley, shadow swallowing him whole. The rancher's gut tightened. The next days were worse. The neighbor by the creek brought men with rifles to stake his claim, driving posts in the ground as if daring someone to pull them up. The rail deputy returned with new contracts, this time with threats between the lines. The scarred man kept appearing in town, speaking to widows, to gamblers, to anyone willing to listen. He bought drinks, he sowed doubts, and his shadow stretched longer with each passing hour. The woman worked harder, the ledger filling with numbers, with accounts of cattle sold, of land measured, of debts tracked down to the last coin. She said if the valley was to fight, it needed facts, not just anger. But he saw the worry in her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. The way her fingers brushed the revolver at her side, as if bracing for the moment words would fail. One night, a shot rang out from the creek. The rancher rode hard with two hands at his back. They found a fence cut, posts scattered, cattle driven toward the neighbor's field. Men shouted in the dark, rifles raised, and for a heartbeat it looked as if blood would spill right there under the moon. But the sheriff arrived with a posse. The fight broke apart with threats flung like knives. The rancher knew it was only a pause, not peace. The air itself felt like a fuse burning down, slow and steady. Back at the ranch house, he sat at the table with the woman. The paper with the old debt lay between them, the ink stark in the lamplight. He had told her enough by now for her to understand, though not every detail. She listened without flinching, without judgment. Only with the same steady calm she had carried since stepping off the stagecoach. "You can't outrun it," she said. "But you can face it, and you won't face it alone." He wanted to believe her. He wanted to think her fire could hold back the storm. But as the night stretched, he heard the hoofbeats in his mind again. The steady rhythm of something coming closer. Something that would not be stopped by fences or ledgers or speeches. When he stepped outside, the stars were sharp against the black sky. In the distance, a lantern moved along the ridge, bobbing like a signal. Another answered farther off. He counted 3, then 4, and new men were moving in the dark. Setting the stage for a clash the valley could not escape. The cattle stirred restlessly, lowing in the night air. The land smelled of dust and smoke. He tightened his grip on the rail and felt the tension coil inside him like a drawn rope ready to snap. He did not know whose hand would strike the spark first, the neighbor, the railman, the scarred messenger, or the past itself, but he knew the blaze was near. Behind him, the woman stood in the doorway, the lantern casting her shadow long across the porch. She did not speak, but he felt her presence like a steady weight at his back. The valley held its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would finally break. The rancher knew then that the climax was close, that the fight would come not tomorrow or next week, but soon. Carried on the sound of hooves and the crack of rifles, in the shouts of men who believed the land belonged to them alone, and in that breathless pause, as the lanterns flickered on the ridge and the dark pressed close, he realized there was no turning back. The storm was here, and it demanded to be met. The valley did not wait much longer. At dawn, the ridge that had glimmered with lanterns the night before broke into motion. Riders came down in a line, some carrying rifles slung across their backs, others with tools that could just as easily be turned into weapons. The rancher stood on the porch, hat pulled low, eyes narrowed against the rising sun. The woman joined him, her ledger clutched under one arm, her revolver at her side. The ranch hands gathered near the corral, tense but steady, waiting for orders. When the riders reached the yard, the neighbor with the thin beard stepped forward, his horse stamping at the dirt. His voice was sharp, meant to carry. "The creek belongs to all of us. I won't let you steal what should flow my way," and the rail company agrees. Progress runs on water as much as on steel. The rancher held his ground. The markers were set long before either of us worked this land. "If you want to drag this to the courthouse, I'll meet you there with the surveyor's book." Murmurs ran through the riders. But before the neighbor could answer, another figure appeared. The scarred man rode in slow, his smile pulling at the jagged mark across his cheek. He dismounted and let his boots crunch the dirt, hands spread as if to say he came in peace. "This fight is bigger than fences and creeks," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "The rail is coming, and men who cling to the past will be crushed. But those who step forward, those who understand how the world turns, will profit. There's no shame in letting go of debts or bargains if you take up new ones. Isn't that right, rancher?" The rancher said nothing. The scarred man's eyes gleamed. "I have papers that say you owe. Papers that name you. Do you want them read aloud here, in front of every man?" The woman stepped forward then, her voice calm but cutting. "Papers can be forged. Debts can be twisted. But numbers do not lie if they are kept true. I have recorded every measure of this land, every deal made, every brand marked. If you claim debt, then show it under the sun. We'll weigh it against the truth." She opened her ledger, and the sight of those neat columns gave pause to more than a few men. The scarred man's smile faltered, but only for a moment. He reached into his coat and drew out folded sheets, waving them like a preacher's sermon. "Here is truth." Here is proof that this man built his fortune on a deal that never paid out. One share missing. One life owed. The rancher's chest tightened. He had carried that shadow for years, the memory of a river crossing gone wrong, of cattle lost, and a partner who never saw his share. He had buried it deep, telling himself survival left no room for guilt. But here it was, dragged into the open. He stepped forward, his voice rough but strong. It's true. A man was owed and never paid. But that man died before I could make it right. His family left, and I never found them. The weight has sat with me since. If they come, I'll pay every cent with interest. But I'll not let you twist a dead man's name to steal my land. The yard fell silent. Even the horses seemed to still. The woman looked at him, not with judgment, but with something steadier acceptance. The scarred man's smile cracked then, the calm slipping as he realized his hold was not as tight as he thought. You admit it, and still they follow you, he said, his voice sharper now. You're a fool. This valley will burn before it bends. He reached for his coat pocket. But before steel could glint in the sun, the sheriff's rifle cracked from the ridge. The shot struck the dirt near the scarred man's boots, throwing dust into the air. Next one won't miss, the sheriff called. He rode down with deputies at his side, their presence tipping the balance. Men shifted uneasily, hands falling away from their belts. The neighbor glared, but he saw the numbers turning against him. With a hard tug of his reins, he pulled his horse around and spat into the dirt. This isn't done, he said. Water doesn't choose sides, and neither do I. His riders followed him out, leaving the scarred man standing alone. The scarred man's smile returned, but it was thinner now, brittle. He tucked the papers back into his coat. You think you've won? But the rail is bigger than all of you. When it comes, no sheriff's bullet will stop it. The rancher stepped closer, his eyes steady. Maybe so. But until it comes, you'll stay off my land. You push once more and you won't walk away. The scarred man studied him. Then the woman, then the gathered ranch hands. He gave a small bow, mocking, and mounted his horse. Without another word, he rode off toward town, his figure shrinking into the horizon. For the first time in days, the yard grew quiet. The men breathed easier, though unease still lingered. The sheriff dismounted, looking weary but firm. This was only a skirmish. The real fight is with the rail company. But you held ground today. When the dust settled and the riders were gone, the rancher and the woman sat at the table again, the ledger between them. He spoke of the debt one last time, of the partner lost, and the silence that followed. She listened, and when he finished, she closed the book gently. Debts are not chains when you face them, she said. They're lessons. What matters is what you build after. Days turned into weeks. The railmen returned with new offers, but the valley stood firmer now. Ranchers banding together, their disputes set aside for a greater fight. The neighbor by the creek grudgingly pulled his riders back, though his glare never softened. The scarred man vanished. One morning, leaving his room at the feed store empty, no trace of the papers he had waved like weapons, the widow bought her boarding house with coins saved from her sewing, her name inked clear on the deed. The homesteaders east of the valley harvested enough to survive the winter, their children running through the fields with laughter instead of hunger. The sheriff kept his rifle close, but his eyes eased, the weight of his watch a little lighter. At the ranch, the house no longer felt empty. The woman's presence filled the rooms, her quiet work shaping order from chaos. She was not the sweet bride the rancher had once imagined. She was something more, something stronger, and though neither of them said the word, both knew the bond between them had become the truest partnership he had ever known. One evening, as the sun bled red over the plains, he walked with her to the edge of the pasture. The cattle grazed in calm silence, the creek glimmering in the distance. He thought of how close it had come to ruin, how easily a man could lose everything to shadows and greed. He thought of how she had arrived, a stranger with fire in her eyes, and how she had turned his world upside down. I asked for someone different, he said softly, but maybe what I wanted was never what I needed. She looked at him then, her eyes steady, her smile quiet. Life rarely gives us what we ask. It gives us what we're meant to face. The rest is up to us. They stood together in the fading light, the land stretching wide around them. The valley still carried scars, still held battles yet to come. But for that moment, it was theirs. The rancher felt the weight of the past ease, placed by a future he could not yet name but was ready to meet. The storms had passed, at least for now. The creek ran steady, the cattle moved slow, and the house on the hill no longer stood empty. What had begun as a search for a quiet life had turned into something far richer, a life forged in fire, tested by conflict, and steadied by the presence of a woman who had shattered his control only to give him back something stronger. And as the stars rose over the valley, the rancher understood at last that control was never the point. The point was standing firm, even when the ground shifted, and finding someone who stood just as steady at your side. That was the life he had built. That was the life he would keep. Top of form, bottom of form.